I am here with May Oskan. May, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, John. I appreciate the invitation.
Thank you. Rough vocal effects. How did you become, first of all, interested in this? And then how did you proceed to learn about them?
Sure. Yeah. I got interested in them because my students were interested in them. I teach all popular music styles, and because most of my performance background has been in like rock and soul music, a lot of my students come to me wanting to learn those kinds of genres. And a lot of songwriters and a lot of people who sing for bands, cover bands, etc. And people just kept increasingly asking me about like, oh, I want to just kind of dirty this up a little bit. I want to make it a little rougher. I want to add a little distortion. I want to have more of a rock sound. And I'm comfortable making most of those sounds, but I didn't really have like a formal strategy for teaching them. So fortunately, I'm also in the midst of my master's degree right now, and I can basically research anything I want. So I decided to do a project on rough vocal effects and decided to just kind of look at what literature was out there and do a little bit of training of my own to kind of refine my own perception of them, my own experience of them. But yeah, so I ended up doing like a literature review and spent some time working with different teachers and in different places, kind of diversifying my own vocal effects. And yeah, it just got to kind of explode. I learned so many more different kinds of approaches. And as a result, I've had a lot more students inquiring about learning them. So it just kind of snowballed from there.
Now, there hasn't been in the past a lot of literature about rough vocal effects. Is this something, are there more and more studies recently?
There are some pretty cool studies that are fairly recent. Most of them are done by like the same kind of group of researchers in Denmark. They're the, complete vocal technique folks. Yeah. They actually include vocal effects in their pedagogy, which is pretty cool. So I went there for 5 days and worked with those folks as well, which was really kind of a highlight of my research process. So they've got a lot of really interesting stuff about like the acoustics of the different effects, the recognizability of the different effects, both in terms of like through seeing visuals from a scope and also just perceptually through listening to them. There's more and more, but it's still like, a tiny, tiny amount of representation. And in terms of research that's outside of the CVT community, a lot of those papers are kind of more general, where, they'll refer to, screaming and be looking at that or looking at growling. And there's like so many different ways to make those sounds, and they're all physically a little bit different. So yeah, there's very, very little literature, but there's more and more all the time. So hopefully that research base will continue to grow.
So what differentiates creating vocal effects, rough vocal effects, safely versus unsafely?
Yeah, I think the main thing, like when students come in and they're like, I sing for this kind of band and I make these kinds of effects and I just want to do them more safely, I want to do them more sustainably. Usually the thing that I notice is like people feel like they have to make these sounds really loudly. So volume is a big consideration. And I think there's a couple of reasons that people kind of perceive vocal effects as needing to be performed really loud. They're really intense, right? They're really emotive. They tap into some pretty intense, emotional states. And so that's kind of part of it. We hear something that sounds like a scream. We know that screaming is loud when we do it just in the wild. So there's a little bit of that perception. And then there's also like recordings, right? They're really processed. Oftentimes rough vocals in recordings will be doubled or tripled or quadrupled. Sometimes there's multiple effects layered on top of each other. Sometimes there's a lot of, just recording effects applied to them as well. So it's a little hard to temper expectations. So yeah, as a result, I think most people are just doing them a little too loudly. The other thing that I notice is a lot of just extrinsic tension, a lot of just squeezing and pushing, and a lot of like muscles standing out, and a lot of extra effort. So just like anything, I think my goal in those cases is like to try to get as much independence in the different structures and muscles as possible, so that people aren't just like squeezing with everything they've got to make an effect that they could use just a small amount of specific effort for.
Now, when someone's doing it unsafely, is the distortion, is the noise being created at the folds versus other places in the vocal tract?
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Sometimes. Some vocal effects do involve vocal cord or vocal fold vibration, whether in addition to the noise. And like we can also use vocal fry and its friends in order to make some vocal effects as well. So it's not to say that vocal effects never involve the vocal folds. They sometimes do. I think the difference is where we're putting the pressure, and also like where we're kind of managing the pressure from, how much of the rest of our body we're employing to help deal with the amount of pressure we're creating in the system, so that it's not just all pressing on the vocal folds. So yeah, that's sometimes the issue, but sometimes the issue, isn't necessarily related to vocal folds. Sometimes it more has to do with like, oh, every time I do like a whole set of distortion, kind of like rock music, my jaw gets really tight. I get this thing in my neck, I just don't feel like I can sustain it. So oftentimes there's other things that are causing issues.
So what is causing the noise in this signal? What various parts of the voice can we use to create distortion?
So many different parts. I like to think about like, even though in research and in practice, like we kind of divide these sounds into families. We've got like the distortion-y ones that we usually use like higher in range. We've got the more stylistically metal-oriented ones, the like low guttural, grunty stuff. We've got the growly mid-range stuff. Like we kind of have families of sounds, but I like to think about it as like they're families, they're groups of sounds, and we can use them in layers. We can use many of these structures at a time. We can also add vocal fold phonation to most of them, right? So it's like these are paints on the palette, but we can use one, we can mix several together. But yeah, I mean, so many different structures. Basically everything in there, we can find a way to loosen it up, get the tissues closer together, and make them make noise. Primarily ventricular folds, so like false folds right above the vocal folds. The arytenoid cartilages themselves can come together and approximate, make noise. The epiglottis can come down to the arytenoids and they can kind of drum against the epiglottis. The aryepiglottic tissue can also vibrate. The cuneiform cartilages in there as well. Basically the whole vocal tract, even our soft palate, like everything is pretty much fair game.
So you can create all different levels of intensity and color depending on how well you can coordinate these different parts of the structure.
Totally. Yeah. And the different parts of the structure coordinate differently, because some of them, like our arytenoids, for example, like those come together through muscle action. There's muscles that bring those cartilages together. Other things like our ventricular folds and our aryepiglottic folds, like we don't really contract those on purpose, right? They're just tissues that have to kind of be loose enough to come together, right? And same thing with our soft palate. We don't like activate it to bring it down. We relax it. So part of kind of differentiating these different sounds is knowing like, how many levels do I want to go here? And is it something where I have to engage something to bring the structures together? Or is it something where I need to relax something in order to bring those structures together?
And it's interesting because it seems we want to activate parts of the vocal tract that in healthy, clean singing, we have a certain way we want them to be, right? We're gonna lift the soft palate, or we're gonna tend to keep the false vocal folds from clamping down and over helping the vocal folds overpress. And so it sounds like we have to learn to activate them, but in a new way, not a primal, just putting the thrusters on.
Yeah, and that goes back to like the idea of like independent control, right? And the issues of being too loud or too tight, right? Because we do need to constrict certain parts of our vocal tract in order to just get these things close enough to vibrate. But we want to do it in a way where we can turn it on and off, right? We don't want to create a situation where that's always on now. And we want to do it in a way that's very specific, especially if we're going to layer different effects on top of each other. We want one thing to be approximated and closed, and we want something else to rattle because it's relaxed. Then we need to make sure that we're not just like hammering down on the whole vocal tract, because that'll be really limiting in terms of just the types of effects that are available.
Do you find that this is easier for some people than others? I thought maybe it might be easier for some people because their vocal tracts are naturally configured that it's a little easier to bring these into action.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I've had people ask me about that before. Like anecdotally, I just don't have enough information, but
Yeah.
I would assume, like based on the folks that I've worked with, the best indicator that someone's going to be able to just like go for an effect and grab it out of thin air and like kind of get the coordination is, folks who have already worked on specific coordinations for specific tones in their voice before. So people who can already access like a really whiny, bright timbre and like a really twangy timbre and like play around with a lot of different vowel sounds and really hear a lot of nuance. Those folks usually have a pretty easy time. And then also people who are used to just playing around with their voices. People who have, by whatever great good luck, maintained that kind of like playful, throw it around, doesn't have to sound any particular way, kind of attitude toward their voice. So a lack of inhibition, I guess, toward just making some weird sounds. Like anything, it's not going to be finished product right away. But yeah, and then just having a little bit of physical awareness and just like experience playing around with, different kinds of gestures in the vocal tract in general.
What tend to be the easier sounds for beginners to make in these effects? And then what are the real advanced sounds?
Sure. Ooh. I think growl is the easiest one. Because we already do it. Like it's basically the same gesture as clearing our throat with our ventricular folds, right? And we can get a little bit of like arytenoid action against our epiglottis pretty easily. Like people who can make like a twangy vowel can almost always growl, I've found. And that's like the little rum, 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 kind of like rev your motorcycle sound, right? Right? People can usually find that one pretty handily. So that's oftentimes the first one I'll introduce because it's accessible. So students can kind of experience quick mastery of something and gain a little bit more confidence around approaching vocal effects. And like, it's a very specific small amount of constriction. Like we don't have to kind of reinvent the whole situation in order to access that sound. And it's kind of it's like a Swiss Army knife of a sound. We use it in soul music. We can add a little flavor to rock music or whatever we want by adding a little bit of growl. So oftentimes I'll start with that one. For rock singers, I feel like the one that people ask for the most is like the high squealy distortion, like the kind of like the Led Zeppelins of the world, right? The just like, or the James Brown scream, right? The like high, piercing, shrill kinds of really intense sounds. I think that one's a little harder for a lot of people to access, especially since it happens usually in performance in a higher pitch range. So it, I think, is really helpful for folks to be comfortable exploring the higher, lighter parts of their voice before they approach that. In terms of the really advanced ones, I think anything that approaches like traditional Tuvan throat singing, like a lot of metal vocals, they kind of pull from a more organized, kind of stable version of the gutturals that are kind of more throat singing, like Kargara style throat singing. That one's tricky because you're actually lining up harmonics. Like your ventricular folds are going to be vibrating at half or contacting each other at half the frequency of your vocal folds. So then you get this nice effect where you have an octave down note from your fundamental playing at the same time. It's a little tricky because it takes a lot of control. And then the other one I think is rattle, which is like the kind of goblin screamy sound, which is our arytenoids coming together to contact each other. That one feels pretty squeezy, and I think it's kind of easy to overdo it. It's also easy to kind of feel like, that doesn't feel right. Like that can't be right, right? Because it's just engaging those muscles a little bit more than they're used to. So I think those are probably the hard ones.
You know, this question just came to me, but we're talking a lot about strength in the vocal tract. Mm-hmm. And as singers get older, one of the things that I found, and I found it true in my own voice, is they worry about at the vocal fold level, right? I'm losing some flexibility, etc. But actually, we lose strength in the vocal tract. And I think that's one of the things that I really have to watch in my own voice. Do you find that this can be harder for older singers to learn to do?
Again, I think my sample size is a little too small to say, of course, with any certainty. But there is a question of just like mass in terms of sounds that do involve the vocal folds. I think it's a little harder sometimes if folks just have a little bit less vocal fold mass to do some of the screamier stuff. And I think, like there's something about like it's strength, but it's also coordination, where it's like strength in specific places at specific times. I have had a few of my older singers struggle with distortion and even growl a little bit more, but I'm like, there's so many questions around that, right? Is it like, there's the neurological parts to consider where like signals travel at a different speed as you get older. There's the mass of the tissue. There's the just amount of mucous membrane available, right? Different levels of hydration for different people. There's, muscle strength. There's awareness. There's many more years of habit as well, singing one particular way or speaking one particular way. So I think that's a really interesting question. I would love to see some research on that.
And what should voice teachers, if they want to learn this and start working with their students, what do you suggest as first steps?
Listen. Like just listen to so many different sounds. These are families of sounds, right? These are collections of sounds. They all have like kind of their own spectrum of qualities that are possible. And then when it comes to using them in concert with one another, that's a whole nother level of complexity. So when we're listening to sounds that, when we're listening to voices that include vocal effects, there's just a lot of complexity and nuance, like listening for the vowel, listening for what structure is it colliding, listening for the level of intensity and how much air pressure we can kind of imagine is in use. So I think just like really engaged and intense listening to just how many different sounds are out there is very helpful. That is also just extends to listening to students in terms of the sounds that they specifically want, because there's so many different ones. Like my idea of like the perfect distortion that I just love, like might not be what my student is shooting for. So if I'm teaching them, and this goes for any clean singing as well, if I'm trying to teach somebody a tone or a gesture that is not the thing that they're shooting for, then that can create like some misunderstanding and some challenges as well. The other thing for teachers who are interested about it is just like try everything out on yourself. Get really comfy with it. Really explore your own capacities. So I feel like sometimes we don't expect our students to be able to access a super broad range of effects because we ourselves haven't done it. So I think it's a challenge that you put on yourself first. And then as it becomes just like, opens up to having a lot more possibilities, then you have a lot more to offer in terms of approaching your students with it.
Great, May. Thank you so much. How can people find out more about you?
Yeah, so my website, mayoskanvoice.com, is a good way to reach me. And yeah, that's basically where. I'm in Oakland. Yeah, I'm always happy to chat vocal effects and to help people troubleshoot not only with their own sounds, but also in approaching different sounds with their students. So yeah, please do get in touch.
This has been great. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks so much, John. It's been a pleasure.